Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris, and on behalf of Books and Books, we welcome you to Neil. Let me see if I say this right. Flanzraich. There we go. To Neil Flanzraich book launch event party. So, while you're silencing your cell phones, please take a moment to look at our calendar. We have these up every month. Brand new events every month, every day, every evening, and a few sort of notable people. We've got Timothy Geithner coming. Michael Pollan. We have next week, Richard Blanco will be making an appearance. Richard Blanco, our inaugural poet. So we also have lots of young adult events for the young people in the audience. Just take a moment to go over that and silence your phones, and we'll get the show on the road. So a little bit about the book. Roxanne Reynolds is just beginning her third year at Maryland High School. She's one of a very small number of people with IQs over 1,000 who calls themselves geniuses. They secretly live among us while concealing their extraordinary intelligence and mental powers. The geniuses living in the Western Hemisphere protect ordinary people from the Eastern geniuses, who use their abilities to try and control ordinary people and dominate the world. Over thousands of years, this has resulted in numerous confrontations between the Western and Eastern geniuses. Andor Lysenko, a young Eastern European genius, has just transferred into Roxanne's school. What does Andor's arrival mean for Roxanne, and what does it mean for the safety of the world? So, Mr. Flanzraich was born in Brownsville, Brooklyn, New York City. His parents were European immigrants, and on a scholarship, he graduated from Harvard College, magna cum laude, and from Phi Beta Kappa, and from Harvard Law School, magna cum laude as well. He has been in the pharmaceutical industry for over 30 years and is currently the chairman and CEO of a biotech company. He is a member of the boards of directors of 2 public companies, and he and his wife, Dr. Kira Flanzraich, live in Coral Gables, Florida. So, welcome home. They have 2 sons, Derek and Jordan, who live in New York City. Mr. Flanzraich wrote fairy tales for his sons when they were little, and his sons later introduced him to the Harry Potter books, which eventually led to his writing this book. So please help me give a warm Books and Books welcome to Neil Flanzraich.
And welcome. Can you hear me? Is it okay? Well, it's all been said. I'm not going to tell you the story, so you probably know as much about the book as you're going to know when you leave. But I think a lot of what my good introducer just said is correct. I was a Wall Street lawyer, and I somehow ended up in the pharmaceutical biotech industry, and been involved with a lot of public companies in that industry over the years. Currently, I'm the chairman and CEO of Cantex, and we're going public right now. So it's very exciting. If you want to hear more about it, I'm happy to tell you. So, as also was said, when my sons were little, Derek and Jordan, we would do what everyone, all parents do. We read them fairy tales. And sometimes, if they liked it, you'd read them the same book over and over. I remember this one was one in particular that not only Kira, who's right here, the mom I'm talking about, and I knew by heart, but my sons also knew it by heart. And after a while, they knew all the fairy tale books by heart. So to keep them entertained, I began making up different stories for them. And I created a kind of magical animal character. It was covered by wool. It was about the size of a cow, but it had gigantic ears like an elephant's. It had a 30 or 50 foot, depending on the size of the animal, tail, could fly, could speak all human languages, and had lots of magical powers. And every evening, they would really insist. And I would have to make up from scratch another story about this animals. And so that was one of my early writing experiences. Years later, I'm traveling miles. You know, pharmaceuticals are sold all over the world. So I'd be on long plane rides to Asia. And I wrote one of those plane rides, a book. I won't bother telling you about it, called The Hair Man. It was about a gentleman who was hair challenged, something I knew something about. And years later, I was at a cocktail party and met a literary agent. And he said, you know, you should write a business book. So, and in particular, because I mentioned to him something I was doing, he said, you ought to write about your negotiations. So I did it. And because I am a kind of aggressive style of negotiating, I called it the Code of the Warrior Negotiator. And since I think that some of those techniques that people develop in business are a little bit proprietary, you want to keep them confidential, my subtitle was, I could tell you how to negotiate, but then I would have to kill you. And so I wrote it just about the year 2008-9, and nobody was buying business books. In fact, so it didn't work at the time. That effort to publish it failed, and that book is sitting somewhere on a shelf. I don't even know where in my house. The next event in my literary career was my sons got me interested in reading Harry Potter. And I read them all, and I loved them, and so did my sons, and we talked about them all the time. So, you know, magical kind of heroes. Well, once again, I'm on another plane ride. We're always traveling. And I was on the way to Australia. I'd done all my work, and I'd picked up a book at the airport, a Robert Ludlum book, I think one of the ones he wrote toward the end of his career, and it was terrible. I don't want to mention which one, but it was absolute drivel. It was like he was paid by the word. I couldn't believe it was so boring. At some point, I threw it down. I said, I can do better, pulled out a pad, and I thought, now, what am I going to write about? And I said, well, you know, Harry Potter, it's about magical heroes. And today, a lot of the heroes in popular culture, you see them in movies, TV, and books, they're extraordinary capabilities. So I thought about it, you know, all this kind of heroes that we see, X-Men, vampires, cartoon, superheroes, and I chose for my heroes and villains super intelligence. So, you know, I'm surrounded by intelligent people in the pharmaceutical industry, geniuses of all kinds. You know, it's the single most characteristic, distinguishing thing about our species as compared to any other. So it seemed like an interesting thing. What would happen if the heroes and villains had extraordinary intelligence? And so I came up, actually, before I wrote the book and had any idea what I was going to write with the title, Geniuses. And so let's talk about geniuses for a few minutes. Like all human characteristics, there's a bell-shaped curve. What that means is most of us, whatever it is somewhere in the middle, and then there are fewer at the extremes of the spectrum. So let's talk about height. Some men are short. I know something about that. But most men are in the US and in Western Europe today are somewhere around 5'8" to 5'10". But the tallest man recorded was almost 9 feet tall. Women, average women are somewhere between 5'2" and 5'7", but you know the tallest woman recorded was almost 8 feet tall. So there is this, at the vast majority in the middle of the bell, and then at the extremes you get some pretty extreme outliers. So intelligence is the same way. The bulk of us, well, they set up this curve is set by arbitrarily that average intelligence is 100, but the majority of people are somewhere between 85 and 115 IQ. As you get out to what's called the distal end, somewhere, whoops, I'm moving rapidly here in the wrong direction, so let me get back. Somewhere over here, if you're more than 140, some experts say that's genius. If you have an IQ of over 150 or 160, you know, most people would say that's a genius level IQ. If you're anywhere near 200, you know, it's kind of not debatable. And a lot of people you've heard names of, like Einstein, those are people who are approaching the 200. So, but let's talk about our brains a little. Our brains weigh about 3 pounds. Our closest living relative, the chimpanzee's brain, is 0.85 pounds. So taking a picture, looking at that a little more closely, it looks so different. We're 4 times bigger brains, but if you actually look at it, the brain of the chimpanzee is remarkably similar to the back of our brain. It's almost the same. What distinguishes humans from our ape relatives is the front part of the brain. And that's called the frontal lobes. That's the location of higher cognitive functions. So anytime that you're solving a problem, or you're making a decision, or you're being creative, or you're just thinking about something hard, not just automatically doing it reflexively or by instinct, you're using your frontal lobes, and that's what separates us from most of the animals. And this is a more precise picture of it. It's really this area here that is why we're human and why we can do things that most other animals can't do. Now, having talked about geniuses in our brains, there's evidence of genius all around us. I mean, today's world, is there any doubt? You see these electronic gadgets, you hear about unbelievable developments in communications, biotechnology, reaching out to outer space and different kinds of satellites, and that's obviously done by superior minds. But there was evidence of genius since the beginning of time. And there were ancient wonders of the world. For example, there were the pyramids. You know, the average guy could not have built the pyramids. They're astronomically aligned, amazing how they took those massive stones that went into, no one knows to this day really how they assembled that. Same thing is true of Machu Picchu. If you've been up there, you know it's a spectacular, amazing place. Stonehenge. You know, these things, everybody sees them, they're an oddity for tourists, but actually those things were aligned in a way that on certain, the winter solstice, the summer solstice, the light comes out in an exact way they could plan for their seasons. The early Celts were working with this. Those things did something. Again, the farmer at the time could not have figured that out. The Mayan people built a lot of these pyramids, amazing ruins that have been left by the Mayans. You know, one of the things I heard as a boy, they said, what happened to the Mayan civilization? At one point, they dominated this whole hemisphere. Where are the Mayans today? Well, actually, the answer is if you go to the Yucatan in Mexico or to Guatemala, the Mayan people are still there. But they're not the ones who designed the irrigation systems, built these massive buildings. What happened to them? Who did that? So there's a lot of mystery about who designed, what were the minds behind those ancient wonders. Some people speculate that it was not just our species, however smart some people are in the normal bell-shaped curve, that did it. That a lot of what goes on in the world is influenced by external forces and powers. Mythology said it was the Greek gods. You know, people, oops, I'm going the wrong way here, but like these guys. And, or recently, and you can see it on television, some people speculate it was ancient aliens from outer space. So my novel gives another explanation, that maybe there are, and I'll go into it in more detail, but maybe there are living among us these super minds that influence us in different ways. I'll come back to that. But the explanation given by most historians, archaeologists, anthropologists today, is that there are among us, and then they're not necessarily all the time, they may come every generation or two or every 100 years, people with superior intelligence. And we know some of the names in recent memory, like Albert Einstein and Tesla, Isaac Newton, who not only everybody knows him for gravity, but he invented calculus, came up with all the laws of motion. He was an unbelievable genius. Gottfried Leibniz was separately, independently developed calculus on his own. Leonardo da Vinci, we all know. You may surprise you that I put on the list Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great. Do you know those guys? Conquered the known world, overcoming vast armies, empires that were poised against them. Genius doesn't just come with physics. It can be our military, strategic, organizational powers, because they then didn't just conquer the land. They built organizational structures and built empires that endured for thousands of years, both of them. They were really geniuses, as well as the ancient Greek scientists and philosophers, Aristotle and Archimedes. But there were many others whose names we didn't know, who were there under the historian view There are people with superior intelligence who acted as the early ancient architects or engineers who designed the pyramids or the Mayan things. And the theory is that those days education was not well spread throughout the population. So the people who had this intelligence and came up with these ideas, when they died, it might have been because of famine or war or some kind of fighting going on, rivalry, they wouldn't pass on their knowledge. And that's why the Mayan civilization folded. The people who built it at some point died out and the rest of them couldn't carry it on. But that's the explanation given by historians. It's worth at least thinking about what makes these superior people like Einstein the way they are. In fact, in the case of Einstein, they actually removed his brain. I modified this slide at the very end because I said after his death, I didn't want you to think they removed it while he was living. But they studied his brain for years. And they found, by the way, a number of physical characteristics in Einstein's brain that are remarkably different from the rest of our brains. I won't bore you with it, they're kind of technical, but some people say that explains his great ability with mathematics and visual, spatial things, and his ability to understand the space-time continuum. But is that true? These are just theories. Nobody knows what makes a person special, why they're smarter, or whether, or there's an underlying question is, are these people who we all attribute these great accomplishments to, did they do it on their own, or did they get inspired by some other force? So again, in my novel, you can believe there was an Einstein, but you would have had another super genius whispering or somehow inspiring and guiding him. So, and the, Now, in my novel, I use these super geniuses as an explanation for the advances of society since the beginning of time. So they were ultimately the brains behind the pyramids, for example. And at the current time, because our novel takes place in the current time, there are 400 to 500 people on Earth out of a population of well over 7 billion today who have IQs of over 1,000, well over 1,000. And they conceal that brilliance because they're afraid of what the masses of us would do to them out of ignorance, fear. So they're able to conceal that they exist. But they don't just have intelligence. They have these special abilities, which I just list here. Some of the characteristics you'll see in the book are telepathy, being able to communicate mind to mind, telekinesis, moving objects with the mind. They were super creative. They can control other people's minds. They can create and erase memories, project laser-like pulses of energy, either to attack or to defend themselves, and use that same mental energy to heal people. They can astrally project doubles of themselves so they can be in more than one place around the world. And some of them have the power of prophecy. Could this be true? Could there be people among us, if they're smart enough to have these qualities, they could probably figure out a way to conceal it. And so you'll have to decide when you read my book. But my book is not just exalting these great minds. Intelligence does not necessarily come with common sense or virtue. And in my book, there are super geniuses who are evil, who want to use their mental power to control and dominate other people and other countries. And happily, for the rest of us, there are also super geniuses who respect ordinary people and want to protect them and permit us to determine our own destinies. But that conflict, which has been going on for millennia, explains much of what our history is. So the wars in our history, going back to the war when young little Athens, the first democracy on our earth, was defending itself against the giant Persian Empire. According to my book, there were geniuses on both sides of that conflict. And the same thing in World War II. According to my book, evil geniuses were behind Hitler in World War II, and good geniuses were behind the Allies. Many of the current news stories, you'll see examples in the book of terrorism, plane hijackings, financial manipulation. Geniuses are involved on either one side or another of those processes. So the book tries to explain and weave in current events as well. A lot of visually exciting things going on. There's one scene in which, when the other good geniuses' brains are not strong enough to save someone, they ask for help from the brains of former geniuses who died thousands of years earlier, but their brains are disembodied and still able to do miraculous things. So as you'll see, this heroine is surrounded by floating brains. And you have to read the book to know why that's relevant. But I do have some underlying themes in the book. My parents were born in Eastern Europe. They were from countries where the Tsar ruled. Kira, my wife, is a refugee from the Soviet Union. I've heard tales of oppression and dictatorship since I was a little boy, and I have become really passionate about liberty, all forms, and freedom. There's another theme going on in the book. The way that these evil geniuses treat ordinary people is ultimately with lacking respect. They don't think they can even decide their own futures. And it raises the question of respect for people who are different in having different advantages and capabilities, or different because of race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation. And it seems to me one of the reasons why I did make this an issue in the book is I think this is a real problem in our society today. If we were treated all people, however different, with more respect, it would permit a dialogue to resolve differences. And at some point, this disrespect for people, even if they have a differing opinion, is stopping that dialogue, which once made America great, and now we're more polarized and divisive. So I thought it was worth talking about respect for others. Also, my heroes are exemplars of virtue. My family, growing up in my immigrant home, I learned honesty, integrity, hard work, loyalty, courage as important things. And all my heroes have those qualities, and all the evil guys are completely lacking in them. So and the book deals with other current issues because we have a lot of teenagers in this story. So the generation gap, how they relate to their parents, bullying in the high schools. And the last theme I'll mention is love. I think for me, it's an overriding theme. I have young love, romance, love between married couples. I think of love as something which is energizing, fulfilling, empowering, and it really makes life sweet and meaningful, and it's a very strong part of my story. So, but I don't want you to think all these heavy themes make this a dry, boring book. It's a real fun read. It's a page turner. There's adventure, excitement, romance, all kinds of fun things going on, and I will tell you more about it, but I want you to buy the book and read it for yourselves. So thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Jack.
Neil, geniuses are born, not made, I presume, so they're born into a culture and environment. Can they rise above that culture and environment and do something greater? Or if they're born in a warrior culture, are they going to become a Genghis Khan?
Well, that's a good question. You mean in general? In my book, one of the people is one of these evil geniuses. He comes as spy to a high school in the West, and at some point, seeing the values of the Western geniuses, he is changed and converted. So you can, you're not all. By the way, I make this geographic distinction that is. I really have to apologize to anybody who's from the Eastern Hemisphere. It was an easy way to say Eastern genius is Western. It's not about that. But people, not all of any group are good or bad, and you can change. As far as, I think people can rise above their culture and their environment. We see it all the time. So in real life, I think that's certainly possible. Yes.
Neil, you told the story about telling your children's story, your two boys. Did you have them review the book as you were writing it, or did you sort of save it to the end?
No, that was probably my mistake. I let them read it all, earlier drafts, and No, they generally said, as you would expect, positive, encouraging things. But what I found was when I said, now it's finished and I've really got the book doing what I want to do, they were disinclined to read another long book and said, I know that story. And I said, no, it's really improved and different. So I'm not so sure if I had to do it over again, I would have just given them the final copy. Yes.
I'm curious about how would you come up with the numbers saying that out of 7 billion people, 500,000 have an IQ of over 1,000?
You know, it's a good question. How I came up with that number. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was like 400 or 500 people. I'm a numbers guy. You know, I do it in business. I do it in everything I do. So I wanted it to be a small enough group that there could be, you know, you'll see each of they each have councils. There's the Council of Eastern Geniuses, Council of Western Geniuses. They have staffs. You'll see any number of characters. It couldn't have been 6 people because dividing them between 2 different networks who are fighting around the world and having people had to be a sizable group. But I wanted it to be a very small because otherwise it would be all around us. We would have heard about it. So in that the bell-shaped distribution curve, I wanted to imagine what would be way, way, way the outlier. And I started with 0.00000, really a lot of zeros. And then I came up with one of my favorite numbers, 8. And I multiplied that by the total, and I Googled the current population of the world, and it came out just at somewhere around 500. I said, that's my number. So, yes.
Yeah, another question. The characters you have, the historical geniuses, except for one, as I remember, are all European.
Well,
nobody from the Americas, North or South, or Africa, one from Asia.
Well, I was just trying to use names that we all know. If you want to add to me, you can send me an email and I will add them to my future talks. I didn't have any that came to mind that I thought everybody would know. Do you have someone in mind?
No, I was just curious.
Oh, no, believe me, I believe there are geniuses in every continent. This is not, you know, people have written books about why Western Europeans' civilizations have advanced more rapidly in the last few hundred years. Not originally. There were lots going on in Asia and Latin America earlier. And it has a lot to do with everything from the mineral wealth to the historical wars that were going on. And in some ways, there was a certain amount of unfairness, but also had to do with climate. And so there's a whole reason why the civilizations didn't advance. But that doesn't relate to the genes. This is one of my hobbies, paleoanthropology. We all came out of Africa. About our, they sometimes call her mitochondrial Eve, the last lineal ancestor of all women on Earth, and the last male ancestor of all men on Earth. They sometimes call him Y chromosome Adam. Were born about 100 to 200,000 years ago. They were in Africa. They emigrated. There was a little bit of interbreeding with species that have left Africa earlier, but basically we have spread out. Our species is the same all over. If you take someone from Australia, there's no difference. It's all really, the difference is a skin deep because of climate and things like that. So we look like we're different, but the aptitudes are the same. So the gene pool mix, the ability to produce an Einstein, exists in every continent, everywhere in the world. The fact that they're not discovered, they may not be educated, they may not be exposed. I mean, it's a really good question you're asking. It's actually profound. And it's part of this, as education spreads now and people are getting opportunities. You go to the universities, great universities of Europe and the United States, you'll have many people from Africa and Asia, and they're now getting exposed to all of that. So I suppose that if you look at the world in a few years, the great geniuses who advance science will be of all nationalities, all races, for sure. There's no question. Yes?
I have a question. Touching on what you said about people being born geniuses, I was curious as to your thoughts on, do you think that everyone might be born with the ability to be a genius and maybe our limiting beliefs or maybe, our culture or lack of education in certain parts of the world? Do you think that kind of...
Yeah, I think there is. People are inhibited. It's, by the way, latest research. This is my hobby, really. I read it all the time. I don't want to sound like an expert. I'm a dilettante. But the latest research is that actually all of us are, we are born immature, and one of the few species that's born helpless. Or, a horse drops out and it can run almost within minutes. And our brains keep evolving. The neurons keep expanding, because if we're any bigger, they couldn't come out of the mother. Our brains are so big relative to other animals. So for a year, or maybe sometimes as much as 2 years, the brains are expanding. It turns out that the environment, both in utero, while they're still in the mother, and once they're alive, influences the way those neurons expand. So a person's intelligence, it's very clear now, can be profoundly influenced by the environment, when they're born, the kinds of things the mother eats, and music even, but also what happens in their early years. So in a real way, we may be limiting people's ability by not giving them good nutrition and exposing them to the right things early in their life. And similarly, we could be making people smarter and better if we were doing the right things. I believe this is the current state of the art. We really know that. So in a real sense, you're right, that many people are born into circumstances which do not permit them to reach their full potential. Yes?
Well, I had my PhD in physics, and I saw down some real geniuses, but the really, really good ones, like Richard Feynman,
Yes.
even how he came to his great ideas are still not known by anybody. I've never seen that written about. Just got a flash, and that was that.
Right.
But even he didn't know how Einstein got the general theory of relativity. So even among each other, they don't understand each other, how the hell they did it. So it's not really trainable. Although Feynman trained very hard with the New York Regents exams, he actually did study. So he's very, very fast in calculations. But how to get to be him, nobody knows how to do that.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I was trying to convey that. We don't know why Einstein was so smart, and we don't know what about him made those theories. That's why I could speculate in my book that maybe that all current advancements came from some other geniuses who inspired some other smart people to do things. But that's a story. The reality is we don't understand genius at all. These are flashes, insights. That's why the Greeks called them muses, like some inspiration came to me. Creativity. By the way, I believe it's sort of like a muscle too. One of the reasons I'm writing this, and I've always tried to, draw, I'm not an artist, but I draw, is because I think it helps me be creative in my work. You can be creative in business, you really can. People think, oh, it's cut and dried. So we can all push the limits on who we are and what our aptitudes are and try something different. That's what I did in writing this book. But the core is we don't understand how you make those leaps. And to have a mind that's open to it, it's the signaling. One of the speculations they had about Einstein's brain, I didn't want to go into it because it's kind of technical, is the glial cells. This is biotechnology, but the glial cells in our body promote something called myelin, the myelin sheaths that cover the axons in our brain. The neurons are the units through which energy is passed throughout our brains, and axons connect them, the fibers. They're coated by a kind of fatty sheath. It's like a clothing that's worn. And it apparently is very important in what's called signal transmission. So if it were to take me, I know what 2 and 2 is, but it takes me like 5 minutes to figure it out, where someone else might get it right away in 30 seconds. Chances are it means my signals are slowing down and not going as fast. In Einstein's case, his signals were going really fast. He could connect from one part of the brain, places that we don't even have connections. And the fact that the signals were going rapidly between those places, that could begin, that's where they try to figure out this very question you're getting at. What was different about his brain? So we don't know, but it's really, what is a genius? I was, speculating a little because I called my book Geniuses, but we don't really know. Thank you. Yes, please.
Without giving it away, and I'm very interested in getting to that part, and I mean, you touched about on the love aspect of and how important that is to life and to happiness. are we gonna be able to differentiate if there's more of a sense of where love had a role in how those geniuses that are on the good side evolved, and the humility?
Absolutely. It was not subtle. And you're going to see how love influences the behavior and the absence of it. I mean, I won't go into the whole story, but family love, love of family, love of a husband's love for his wife, for his family, his children, is so prominent and important for these good geniuses. It's the motivating thing that makes them achieve what they can. The evil geniuses, you'll see, they don't have families, they disrespect the idea of family, they think it's a weakness. So I build that into the story because I think that's what, it almost makes them, because I think it's such an important part of human life that when I have this category of people, they're all supposed to be humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, just as some have bigger brains. But when they are so negative and lacking in love, it makes them inhuman and alien. And that's sort of where I made them exotic and terrible villains. But they don't have it. So you'll see, it'll be clear in how it operates in the book. Read the book. Yes.
A real life genius that has moved you, that has inspired you?
Well, I have actually, I could list a long list of the scientists who, in many of the companies I've worked, created all breakthrough things that have changed everyone's lives. I don't ever like to talk about friends and publicly, but the few of them, their accomplishments are listed as the greatest advances, medical advances of the 20th century. I mean, they were geniuses. There's no question that our lives are all different because of what they did. And, but also, I see geniuses elsewhere. For example, I've been very lucky in my family that I know a few people who are geniuses, and among my sons, I don't want, without being, I think, I see it, and I happen to think that Kira is a super smart person. I mean, she's very smart. Let me tell you, if you know Kira, you'll know it. So I'm around a lot of very smart people, and I think about what makes them so smart.
Could you talk about that? Salvador Dali, I think, is genius.
Well, see, what creativity and art, right? And before he did it, once we all see those mirrors and distorted images and the reality that is not really reality, all of that was created out of his mind. So it's when I said about Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan that they were brilliant in some area, obviously art, Picasso, Salvador Dali. These are creative minds. You can ask the same question, what? How come they have that special ability that others don't have? You know how many people try to be artists? And they're good artists. I mean, really a lot of people are good artists. But then you see somebody who stands out and you say, what makes that person special? And part of it, by the way, is hard work. We're all hard. You have to, I believe that Michael Jordan and maybe LeBron James and there are physical athletes that are just superhuman almost and wonderful, but we all know they work very hard. But it's more than that. So that many people, the story about Mozart and Salieri? Salieri was a composer and a musician at the same time as Mozart. And he worked so hard, always hard. He was fairly successful during his lifetime. But they've written operas and now plays how he hated Mozart because Mozart did it effortlessly. He was just born with it. And that's that story of Mozart and Salieri. Well, I mean, he unfortunately made the mistake of comparing himself. It's the worst thing, I believe, the worst thing a person can do, compare yourself to anyone else. There's always going to be somebody taller, stronger, smarter, or something, and it makes you feel bad. So it's a losing proposition. But you can admire people, but you don't have to say, I feel bad because someone is taller or smarter. However, he was envious. It's the most negative, it's a negative energy. It doesn't help you at all. So, but are there differences? Yes. And these great geniuses like Mozart, he was not a guy who wrote those great symphonies because he worked hard. It came out of him from I think it was 5 or 6 when he started. So there is something, and it goes back to this issue, what is different in their minds? And yes?
I just wanted to add to your point, some studies, functional MRI studies have shown that people can take the same test and the really smart ones hardly have to spend any energy getting through the test because their connections are so fast. apparently the myelin is really good.
Right.
Because no signal is wasted, going from side to side. It goes straight.
Yeah, those functional MRI things are really helping us to study the brain. But that's exactly right. For some people, this is effortless. Others, it's energy. It takes longer. And these, what I mentioned before, the myelin sheaths, the signal transmission in the brain. Also, the number of neurons. Again, going back to babies are born with a huge number, and it keeps growing. But actually, they disappear after a while. And so not as you're an adult, but getting to the point where you're finalized, there are a lot less than you had at your maximum point as an infant. You get to see, some keep that extra large number, and the transmission of the signals between them, that'll really give them greater brain power. So the number of neurons and the speed with which the signals can be transmitted between them, that affects everything from memory, cognitive function. And you know that when you study these, the disorders that affect memory, like Alzheimer's, then there's problems interfering in that process, like plaque and amyloid, that are breaking down the normal functioning of these signaling pathways. That's what Alzheimer's is. Yes?
It's interesting in adolescence. One of the reasons they make such bad decisions, and we all laugh at how badly they're behaving, is there's a pruning effect at that moment of time. And of all these neurons, it's like a tree, and they do some pruning, and it hasn't gotten to where it needs to be yet, and so they, historically make some very interesting choices.
No, that's exactly right. Life evolution at different ages, and you can actually track how many neurons, where you are. The brain, maybe you remembered, I don't remember. The actual skull, because it's expanding to permit the growth, doesn't actually finally seal till about, I think it may be into the teenage years. But, so you think, well, by the time someone is 10 years old, their brain is formed, right? No, the skull isn't even hard yet because it's still expanding. Yes?
So I got fed some stuff by my parents who call brain food. So do you have, for nutritional values, things you would recommend?
I will recommend you to go to my son Derek's website, Greatest. It's Greatist, like dentist. He couldn't get Greatest because Muhammad Ali owns that. But Greatest IST is about health and fitness, and he will give you it's very into health and fitness, good nutrition. I think there are foods that will obviously promote good growth in mind as well as good growth in bodies. And so that are ultimately forms of protein, good proteins that will help build brains. And then another thing, which is the body has this cleaning system. This is why you have to sleep at night. We have a filtering system. It cleans virtually every cell in our body. Some old cells are killed. It's called apoptosis. Other cells, they clean out the insides of the cells. It's a very sophisticated process that goes on. It's like the night janitors come in and clean us up. Well, it's going on all the time. If it doesn't happen perfectly, that's what builds the plaques and the function breaks down. So if you're not getting the cleaning done in a normal brain, and there are foods that you can eat that facilitate that. So, and those are usually in the category of antioxidants. So my favorite food is a general good thing. I'll give you my favorite thing, which is really healthy. I think I can, most things have pluses and minuses, but this is one with just pluses. Blueberries. Let me suggest that if you add blueberries to your diet, it won't hurt you. Well, oh yes, sure.
I have one question. I have a little trouble grasping that notion of villain genius. Semantically, in one sentence, it doesn't click for me, but can you give me an example of a historic figure?
Well, first of all, remember I said that great intelligence it does not necessarily bring with it either common sense, good judgment, or virtue. It's really true. And so during I'll give you not names, although I actually could think of somebody, that during the Nazi years, Hitler's scientists were working on developing their own version of the atom bomb, and they developed these V2 rockets that were unbelievably bombing London and almost destroying it. It's amazing courage of the English people. They were into missiles before anybody else on Earth. We took their scientists and it helped put our men on the moon. Those were geniuses. Wernher von Braun is one of them. I mean, the guy was a genius. He was a leader in developing, exploring space, building missiles. You want to get into his ethics, that would be another whole issue. I mean, we took him into our side because we didn't want the enemy to have him. But those guys were trying to make bombs to kill people in ruthless, terrible ways. So there are geniuses in the world who use their brain power for bad purposes, for sure. Yes?
Sequel?
I'm sorry? Sequel. Thank you. Well, if you get to the end, you'll see that I at least hint that there will be a sequel. So I've kept that possibility open, and I'm already beginning to think about it, but I haven't written it. Thank you.
For those of you watching at home, you can order the book, and we can ship it to you free of charge if you're living out of state. In state, of course, state taxes. So books are available at the front register here. And if we could please fold up the chairs and put them against the walls or shelves, and there's a reception here afterwards for your enjoyment. And thank you all again for coming.